One can travel to nearly any village across the province and hear the tale of the golden demon's capture. In Ionian taverns and at roadside shrines, elder storytellers recite the same refrain while children listen with breathless fascination. They describe the day when the mountain passes ran red with blood, when an invisible monster haunted the southern forests, and when a humble stagehand named Jhin became the most infamous killer in the First Lands. Yet no spoken tale or epic poem truly conveys the quiet horror of his beginnings. This is a story told not as a list of events, but as a slow journey through a mind and a land. It begins not with a flourish, but with a whisper in a valley where magic saturates every stone and reed. In the fertile lowlands of Jhin, where rice terraces step down to lazy rivers and willow trees weep into reflective pools, a boy who would one day call himself the Virtuoso grew up among travelling performers. The troupe he served was unremarkable, more notable for its painted wagons than any real talent. They presented tragedies and comedies in makeshift stages built under plum trees. Their music carried on the warm evening air. To most, the boy was invisible. He fetched props, held lanterns, and swept sawdust after the audience had gone home. There was nothing in his delicate hands or shy demeanor to hint at his fascination with mortality. Yet, while other children played at sword fights, he watched the way shadows bent across a performer's neck as the actor mimed a death scene. He observed the timing of a gasp, the way painted blood ran down a cheek. Somewhere between the movement of curtains and the smell of oil lamps, an idea began to take shape. Death itself could be a form of art. The boy had no formal name that anyone used. Stagehands were seldom introduced. He slept on the floor of a wagon, ate whatever was left after the performers finished their meals, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. When he did speak, his voice was soft and careful, as if he were measuring each word before releasing it. The world inside his head was richer than the one in which he existed. He had seen glimpses of Ionian magic at festivals a dancer's fan that produced living blossoms, a monk who could strike the air and send a gust of wind across the stage. But what truly captivated him were not the tricks themselves, but the reactions of the audience. Gasps, shouts, silence. These, he realized, were the brushstrokes of an unseen painter. To move a crowd was power. To hold their breath in suspension was a masterpiece. As the troupe wandered from hamlet to hamlet, he watched people die natural deaths. Villagers sometimes succumbed to fever or injury while the performers were in town. The boy attended those funerals not out of affection, but to study the rituals, the way relatives keened and wailed, the cadence of prayer chants, the placement of flowers. Each ceremony was performed according to ancient tradition, but he saw in them patterns he could manipulate. Death could be staged, framed, and lit. If beauty existed in the contrast of colors on a canvas, then perhaps there was beauty in the contrast between life and its sudden absence. The thought frightened and thrilled him in equal measure. No one knows when he killed for the first time. Not even he would later recall the exact moment, because to him it felt like the inevitable conclusion of countless observations. There are rumors that it happened on a warm evening when the troupe camped beside a field of moonlit wildflowers. The boy slipped away from the tents and found a wounded animal, a fox caught in a hunter's snare. He watched it struggle, its breaths shallow and frantic, its fur matted with blood. He freed it from the trap not to save it, but to watch the moment when freedom turned to collapse. He felt nothing like guilt when it died. Instead, he felt the weight of something new settling inside him. The world was full of endings, and he could shape them. Later, as the troop travelled through the mist-shrouded foothills of Shonzan and Galrin, entire families began to die. Travellers disappearing in the passes were first written off as unfortunate victims of bandits or beasts. But soon the bodies were found in grotesque poses, their limbs arranged as if they were performing for an invisible audience. At first, those who discovered the scenes thought them the work of evil spirits. The corpses were adorned with flowers and masked by scraps of theatrical costumes. The boy worked quickly, carefully choosing locations where his exhibits would be found by farmers or monk patrols. He placed each body as if composing a painting, focusing on symmetry and the interplay of light through the trees. At dawn, dew glittered on the white silk draped over a victim's face. At dusk, the setting sun painted everything crimson. He did not work for praise, but for the moment when those who stumbled upon his scenes inhaled sharply and whispered prayers. Those reactions were his applause. The southern mountains whispered of a monster. The Golden Demon, they called it, though no one knew why that name was chosen. Perhaps it was because the killer struck in fields of wheat when the harvest was ripe. Perhaps it was because some victims were left clutching gold coins, or because of rumors that a masked thing with golden eyes lurked at the edge of the forest. Whatever the origin, fear took root in Jhin. Merchants hired armed escorts. Villages locked their gates at dusk. Wuju masters and demon hunters patrolled the trade routes, yet none came close to catching the elusive murderer. The boy watched the increasing panic from the wings of his makeshift stages and smiled behind his props. Fear made audiences more receptive. Fear made them lean forward, listening for the next sound. Fear was the frame that held his art. With each new arrangement, his style evolved. He experimented with posture, propping a corpse upright to watch its head slowly tilt forward as rigor mortis set in. He tested colors, draping bodies in blue silks that contrasted with green grass. He learned how long blood would remain bright before it darkened. He began leaving subtle clues, a lotus pattern drawn in blood, a scrap of poetry pinned to a sleeve, so that those who came upon his work might recognize subsequent pieces. The idea of a signature thrilled him. A true artist, he thought, was known by his style. To create a style, one needed a motif. The number 4, with its neat symmetry and finality, became his compass. 4 victims in a tableau, 4 notes in a chime hung above a body, 4 lanterns arranged around a mound of earth. 4 always, because an audience noticed patterns, even if they did not consciously understand them. The murders did not go unnoticed by those charged with keeping balance in Ionia. When the council of Jhin grew desperate, and the Wuju martial artists admitted defeat, messengers were sent to the Kinku Order. Great Master Kusho, known throughout the First Lands as a banisher of spirits and a teacher of difficult truths, received the envoys in a garden where peach blossoms drifted like snow. Kusho was reluctant to divert his order from its duty of maintaining harmony between the material and spirit realms. After all, he reasoned, demons were not easily caught with swords. But when he read the reports, saw the meticulous cruelty described therein, and sensed the dread spreading through the villages, he agreed to investigate. he decided that the matter could not be left to superstitious speculation. If a spirit was at work, he would banish it. If a mortal was the cause, he would see justice done. In either case, the balance had been disrupted. Kusho did not travel alone. He took with him his teenage son, Jhin, whose wit and humor made even solemn monks smile, and his promising young apprentice, Zed, whose skill and discipline made him the brightest star of the Kinku's temple. The trio journeyed in secret, not to draw attention to their mission, but to avoid alerting the monster they sought. On narrow forest paths and through misty passes, they listened to farmers describe their fear and anger. They visited sites where corpses had been found, taking care to study each arrangement. Shen's easy charm softened the villagers' distrust, allowing them to speak openly. Zed's keen eyes searched for patterns among the chaos. Kusho himself knelt beside twisted bodies, closing eyes with calloused fingers, tasting the metal of dried blood in the air. What they found disturbed them. This was no demon that had slipped between worlds. This was a mortal, and a careful one at that. The investigation was not swift. It lasted years. Seasons turned, and still the killer eluded them. Kusho's once vibrant mane of red hair faded to white as the winters passed. Shen's jokes became rarer, his eyes shadowed by what he had seen. Zed, who had once meditated with ease on the lessons of equilibrium, found his dreams haunted by the grotesque displays. The killer seemed to know they were coming and adjusted his pattern accordingly, sometimes striking in a region just after the Kinku had left it, sometimes going dormant long enough to make them question whether he was done. The hunt was a slow torture. Over time, the three men began to change as much as those they sought to protect. They understood that they were not only looking for a murderer, but confronting the nature of evil itself. Was this cruelty inherent in the killer, or had it been nurtured by neglect? Was he a product of spirit imbalance or of human apathy? They debated these questions in whispered conversations around campfires as they took shifts watching the sleeping world. Finally, after 4 long years, a pattern emerged. Kusho studied the timing, the dates and distances, and realized that the killings aligned with certain festivals and market days. The murderer followed the traveling theatrical troupes. This revelation brought both relief and frustration. It meant that the killer was not supernatural, which simplified some things, but it also meant that he moved among crowds, hiding in plain sight. Kusho told his companions that good and evil are not immutable forces that exist outside of humans. They are born from men, he said, and each person sees the shades differently. The monster they hunted had been raised among them. He might have even sat beside them at a play. Shen and Zed disagreed on how to proceed. Shen, ever mindful of his father's teachings, argued for patience. They should gather irrefutable proof before acting, he insisted, for if they accused the wrong person, the consequences for Ionian society would be dire. The delicate harmony between villages and guilds could be shattered by baseless accusations. Zed, increasingly tormented by the suffering he had witnessed, favored swift action. Every day they delayed, another family could be destroyed. Kusho listened to his son and his student, weighing their arguments against his own sense of justice. Ultimately, he decided to set a trap. The Spirit Blossom Festival in Jhin Pass was approaching. Artists from across Ionia would gather to share their work. Kusho disguised himself as a calligrapher of some renown, a man expected to arrive late and keep to himself. Shen and Zed blended into the crowd as attendants, their weapons hidden beneath layers of silk. Paper lanterns swayed overhead, casting a warm glow across the festival grounds. Musicians tuned their zithers and lutes. The air carried the fragrance of grilled fish and plum wine. Beneath the surface of the celebration, tension coiled like a spring. Kusho waited, his brush poised above rice paper, though he never touched it to write. Shen watched performers move in and out of the staging area. Zed's gaze swept constantly, noting every out-of-place gesture. When the murderer moved, he did so with the ease of someone accustomed to going unseen. He stepped from between two wagons, his face unmasked but unmemorable, his hands carrying a basket of props. There was nothing in his slender frame to mark him as dangerous. Yet Kusho knew. A flicker of recognition passed between master and killer. Shen's heart pounded, but he maintained his composure. Zed's fingers twitched toward his concealed blade. The man with the basket froze as he realized he had been seen. Panic flashed across his eyes, but only for a heartbeat. His expression returned to placid obedience as he set the basket down. The trap had sprung. The confrontation that followed was quiet. There was no shout, no chase. Kusho approached the stagehand with the calm authority that could quell tempers and banish spirits. Zed moved to flank the man, tension evident in the lines of his posture. Shen stepped behind, blocking any avenue of escape. A hushed conversation took place, words lost beneath the louder music of the festival. Kusho addressed the murderer not as a monster, but as a person. He asked him his name. The man murmured, Jhin. His voice was polite, almost deferential. It was the same careful tone he used when speaking to actors, as if he had never quite learned how to raise it. When Zed reached for his blade to strike, Kusho extended a hand to stop him. Killing the murderer here, in the middle of a festival, would cause chaos. It would reveal too much about the frailty of Ionian harmony. Kusho reminded his student that they had already overstepped their remit as keepers of the balance by hunting a human. To execute him without trial would further undermine the trust others placed in them. He turned his gaze to Jhin, who met it with disconcerting calm. The man's eyes were dark and unreadable. Kusho saw no remorse in them. He saw only curiosity, as if Jhin were studying the great master in return, deciding where to place him in his next scene. It is said that Zed never forgave Kusho for showing mercy that day. He felt the weight of each body they had found, felt them as if they were his own failures, and could not comprehend leaving the killer alive. Shen disagreed with the decision, but obeyed his father. Kusho believed that imprisoning Jhin would remove him from the world without making him a martyr. If people knew that the golden demon was not a spirit but a mortal man, would they become less vigilant? Would they see him as proof that anyone could cross the line between civilian and monster? The balance was too fragile to risk. Jhin was taken, bound yet unbloodied, to the monastery prison at Tula. It was a place built to contain those who threatened harmony, not only demons, but also humans whose minds and magic endangered others. Tula's stone walls were worn smooth by centuries of salt air and rain, its courtyard shaded by cherry trees. The prisoners there were taught disciplines meant to channel and sublimate destructive tendencies. Jhin found himself in a world of quiet contemplation. Monks in muted robes meditated for hours, their breathing measured and calm. He had never known such stillness. It did not soothe him. Instead, It gave him space to refine his obsessions. The monks noted that Jhin was an attentive student. He learned their chants and rituals quickly. He could sit for hours in perfect stillness, his posture more graceful than most. He read poetry and sacred texts, dissecting them not for spiritual insight, but for rhythm and imagery. When given access to a forge, he forged his own writing implements, sharpening and tempering metals with a precision that surprised his teachers. His obsession with pattern extended to everything he touched. He practiced calligraphy until each stroke was identical in weight and length. He danced to the monks' drums, each movement crisp and measured. They hoped that channeling his need for control into art would redirect his mind. They were wrong. It only honed his skills. Meanwhile, beyond Tula's walls, Ionia was changing. The empire of Noxus invaded the First Lands, and war spread like wildfire through forests that had known only peace. The monks of the Kinku fought to maintain balance while soldiers took up arms and villagers fled burning homes. The tranquil terraces of Jhin were trampled by foreign boots. Houses that had once held families now held occupying soldiers. The monks at Tula listened to news of battles and debates between pacifists and radicals. Some argued that Ionia must arm itself and militarize magic to survive. Others clung to non-violent traditions. The discussion fractured communities that had stood united for centuries. Within the prison, Jhin listened to such reports with the detached interest of one hearing a different kind of performance. He saw in the chaos a different kind of canvas. No one knows exactly who arranged Jhin's release. Some say it was members of the Ionian Council, sympathetic to radical factions. Others whisper that secret patrons within the Kashuri armories wanted to test new weapons and sought someone who would use them without question. The truth is likely a tangled web of both. What is clear is that one day, during the later stages of the war, a group of strangers came to Tula. They spoke to the elders with the authority of those who held power, produced sealed documents, and requested custody of prisoner Kada Jhin. Perhaps the elders were promised that releasing him would save lives elsewhere, or perhaps they were deceived. They acquiesced. When Jhin walked free from Tula, he did not do so alone. He stepped into the company of men who wore fine robes and carried themselves like officials. Their faces were hidden by hoods. They said little to him as they led him away from the monastery through groves of camellia and along mountain paths. During the journey, they handed him a long, narrow case. Inside was a weapon unlike any he had seen. It combined Ionian craftsmanship with foreign technology. Carved wood and polished metal fitted together seamlessly. When Jhin lifted it, he felt its balance as if it were an extension of his own arm. It was a firearm, though its workings were far more complex than the crude muskets he had glimpsed on Noxian soldiers. It was a gun that sang when fired. It was also a cane, allowing him to lean upon it like a gentleman. He smiled for the first time in years. 4 barrels, 4 shots, perfection. In that moment, the quiet stagehand died, and the Virtuoso was born. The mask he crafted to hide his face was not merely a disguise, but a statement. It was smooth and white, with narrow eye slits and gold filigree along the edges. Behind it, his expressions were hidden, leaving only the cold gleam of his eyes visible. The mask became his persona, elegant, enigmatic, detached. He found silks and leathers that flowed with his movements, draped like costumes on a stage. He was no longer content to arrange bodies in the shadows and hope that farmers discovered them. He would create performances, spectacles witnessed by crowds, scenes that would be retold in legend and song. The world had given him a weapon and resources. He would repay the favor with art. Before he could paint on a grand canvas, he needed to rehearse. His first performance after leaving Tula took place in a remote valley. He chose a house at the edge of a village, a modest place where a family slept peacefully. He waited until the moon rose, then slipped inside like a shadow. 4 shots whispered through the night, each one precise and deliberate. He did not leave the bodies where they fell. He arranged them in their small courtyard, placing the parents and children around a table set for breakfast. He poured tea into cups, still hands shaking, not with nerves, but with anticipation. When the sun climbed and neighbors came calling, they saw what looked at first like a family gathering. Only as they approached did they realize the awful truth. Their screams echoed through the valley, and Jhin listened from afar, noting the pitch and duration. It was a modest beginning, but every artist must start somewhere. Word of his return spread quickly among those who had feared the golden demon. Now, however, his work bore a new elegance. He signed his performances with lotus flowers and carefully arranged props. He began to see each act of murder not only as a painting, but as part of a larger composition, a play with acts and scenes. He wrote poems and pinned them to victims, each line hinting at the next performance. He moved across the first lands like a director, moving from stage to stage, always just out of reach of those who might stop him. The new gun he wielded made his killings both more efficient and more dramatic. Its shots rang out like notes of a stringed instrument. Each shot mattered. The first established the rhythm, the second built tension, the third raised the stakes, the fourth concluded, delivering finality and silence. There is a story that, after his release, Jhin traveled to the coastal city of Kyanvi to meet a patron. In a tea house lined with bamboo and paper screens, he sat across from an older man whose hands were calloused from years of training soldiers. This man, referred to only as an old master, spoke of group of nefarious villains who had stolen sacred artifacts and betrayed their countrymen. He asked Jhin to dispose of them. The request was couched in terms of justice, but what he offered in return was a blank canvas. Jhin accepted. He did not see himself as an assassin taking orders. He saw himself as an artist commissioned to create. The difference was important. Payment was not just coin, but the freedom to choose the stage and craft the script. He planned the performance with meticulous care. The targets were spread across different quarters of the city, each hidden among allies and unaware that death stalked them. He decided to kill them in quick succession so that the sounds of the earlier shots would draw audiences for the later ones. He mapped the streets, noting lines of sight and acoustics. He observed how sound carried along canals and through alleyways. He timed the performance for late afternoon, when golden sunlight would bathe the city in warmth and shadows would be long. He positioned lotus bombs in precise locations, disguising them as decorative lanterns. Each contained a mixture of explosive powder and petals that would scatter when triggered. He rehearsed in his mind, seeing each shot as part of a musical piece. 4 beats, 4 lives, 1 masterpiece. On the day of the performance, the city bustled unaware, Merchants haggled, children chased each other around vendors, and fishermen mended nets on the quay. Jhin moved through the crowd as if he were invisible. In truth, he had chosen clothing that made him blend in, a simple cloak and a conical hat that cast his face in shadow. His cane tapped rhythmically on the stone as he walked. He smiled to himself, feeling the familiar excitement that came before an opening act. Reaching the first location, a courtyard where one of the traitors was hosting a private meeting, he positioned himself across the street. He drew his gun and lined up the shot. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the hum of voices like a plucked string. The first target slumped forward, his head lolling to one side. Those around him froze. They looked for the source of the sound and saw nothing. Jhin faded back into the moving crowd, already seeking his next mark. The second target was by a shrine, lighting incense. Jhin waited until the man's hands were raised in prayer, his eyes closed. The second shot cracked the air. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, mixing with the ash of burned offerings. Worshippers screamed and backed away, many thinking they had offended a spirit. Jhin walked on, the corners of his mouth twitching under his mask. Each gasp, each panicked cry was part of his score. He imagined himself a conductor leading an orchestra of terror. The third target was on a rooftop, overlooking the harbor. Jhin ascended an adjacent building, taking care to remain unseen. From his elevated perch, he could see the city stretching toward the horizon, sails like white brushstrokes against the deep blue of the ocean. He waited for a gull to cry before firing. The third shot rang out, and the target dropped, his body rolling down the roof tiles before catching on the gutter. People below pointed upward in confusion and fear. They whispered of ghosts and curses. Jhin felt their hearts racing even from this distance. The final target gathered with his compatriots in an ornate garden, each wall painted with scenes of legendary heroes. Lanterns hung from trees, their light gentle. Jhin could have taken the shot immediately, but he chose to wait. He wanted an audience. He knew that the sound of 3 shots would have reached different parts of the city. People would be alert now. They would be listening. He triggered his lotus bombs, and small explosions sent petals swirling through the air. The garden guests looked up in amazement, their expressions turning from delight to horror as they realized the petals were accompanied by shards of porcelain and splinters of bamboo. Jhin stepped into the entrance of the garden, where his silhouette was framed by the archway. He lifted his weapon, each movement slow and graceful. He aimed not at the body of the final target, but at his heart. The shot echoed, louder than the previous ones because of the walls around the garden. The man fell, petals settling on his still body like snowflakes. Jhin bowed slightly to the onlookers as he lowered his gun. For a moment, no one moved. Then the screams began. The performance was complete, but the news of it spread like wildfire. People whispered that the golden demon had returned, but this time his work was more than mindless slaughter. It was pointed. It had commentary. Those who had died were not random travelers, but men accused of corruption and betrayal. Some among the city's elite applauded in secret, relieved to be rid of rivals. Others trembled, wondering if they might be next. Jhin listened to these reactions with satisfaction. To him, it did not matter whether his actions were interpreted as justice or madness. It mattered that they were interpreted at all. He had not been forgotten. He was no longer a spirit whispered about in cautionary tales. He was an artist with a signature style, and his work demanded discussion. As Ionia struggled to rebuild after the Noxian invasion, factions vied for power. The Navori Brotherhood called for unity through strength, advocating for militarization and control. The Order of Shadow, led by Zed, trained assassins who would do whatever was necessary to protect their homeland. Karma and the Central Ionian Council sought harmony and caution, trying to preserve traditions while negotiating a precarious peace. In this environment, Jhin's performances took on new significance. When he assassinated a minor official, both radicals and moderates claimed the act supported their cause. When he massacred a group of armed extremists, it was seen as a warning against excess. He understood that by staying inscrutable, he could manipulate the narrative. People would argue about his motives, projecting their own fears and desires onto his blank mask. Shen, now the Eye of Twilight and head of the Kinku, felt the weight of his father's decision more keenly than ever. Each time news of a new Jhin performance reached him, he saw not only the victims, but also the moment in the past when his father had decided to spare the murderer's life. The resentment that had grown in Zed's heart all those years ago had blossomed into the Order of Shadow, and that order now exists outside of the Kinku's traditional balance. Shen sought to maintain equilibrium, mediating between factions, but his focus could not always be on chasing one man. Zed, for his part, saw Jhin's actions as both threat and opportunity. He knew the killer better than most, having hunted him once and fought him again during covert skirmishes. He had attempted to end Jhin's life more than once after the man's release, yet Jhin always slipped away, leaving behind scenes of carnage that seemed to taunt him. Their history entwined them even as their philosophies diverged. One focused on balance, the other on necessary darkness. Jhin made them dance to his tune. There are tales of Jhin crossing paths with Irelia, the blade dancer and leader of the Ionian resistance. Some say he targeted her to test himself against a legend. Others claim that his patrons instructed him to eliminate her to destabilize Ionian unity. Whatever the truth, the encounter was dramatic. He lured her to a town square under the guise of negotiations, setting traps in the surrounding buildings. Irelia arrived with her blades floating behind her like petals. She spoke to him not as a monster but as a man, calling him by his given name. For a moment the mask dipped, and his eyes met hers. He saw in her the disciplined grace of a dancer, and she saw in him the distorted reflection of an artist. When the fight erupted, her blades moved like a river, deflecting his shots and shredding his traps. He retreated with a theatrical flourish, lotus petals swirling in his wake. He did not intend to kill her that day. He had felt the energy between them, the push and pull, and recognized it as the tension in the second act of a play. There would be another encounter, another scene, when the timing was right. Jhin's influence did not remain confined to Ionia. The weapon given to him allowed him to strike from distances unimaginable with traditional bows. The knowledge that such technology existed traveled with him. He ventured to Piltover and Zaun, cities built on innovation and greed. There he was both fascinated and repulsed by the bustle of progress. In Piltover he saw hextech that glowed blue with contained magic. In Zaun's depths He saw chem-barren palaces where alchemy blurred the line between life and machine. He performed a piece in Piltover's theatre district, targeting a corrupt shipping magnate who had profited off the back of factory workers. He arranged the man's death as if it were part of the opera on stage, timing the shot to coincide with a soprano's high note. The audience did not realize until the curtain fell that one of the performers would never stand again. In Zone, he eliminated a chem baron by sabotaging his machinery, causing pipes to burst and send green flames into the air. Those who witnessed the disaster spoke of a figure in a white mask watching from a catwalk, his head tilted as if judging the composition. Across Runeterra, rumors of a masked killer spread. Some used the tales to scare children into obedience, describing him as a shadow that punished misbehavior. Others told stories in hushed admiration, fascinated by his artistry even as they condemned his cruelty. Caitlin, Piltover's sheriff, heard of the performance in her city and began to investigate. She prided herself on her marksmanship and ability to read criminals. Yet, when she tried to track Jhin, she found nothing but shadows and rumors. He left no fingerprints, no stray footprints. The gun he used was unlike any Piltover had manufactured, its design both foreign and familiar. She consulted with artisans and inventors, piecing together its origin, but by the time she identified the connection to Ionian craftsmanship, Jhin was gone. Jhin's philosophy continued to evolve. In the beginning, he killed to satisfy an internal urge to create beauty from horror. As he matured in his art, he began to see his performances as commentary on the subjects he chose. He claimed that death should never be quick. It should be an opera. He believed that those who watched his work should feel something profound, whether awe or terror. He saw himself as a sculptor who chipped away at the facade of civilization to reveal the fear and hypocrisy beneath. His mask allowed him to present a neutral face, while behind it his mind calculated angles and angles. He wrote poems before performances, sometimes leaving them as warnings and sometimes burning them after memorizing them. To him, the process of creation was as important as the final product. He studied the traditions of theatre from across the First Lands, drawing inspiration from puppet shows, shadow plays, and Noxian tragedies. He incorporated their elements into his killings. He composed symphonies of gunshots and screams. Though he remained enigmatic, there were patterns to his actions that those who studied him recognized. He favored the number 4, always shooting 4 times, always planting 4 bombs or leaving 4 candles. He often targeted people of influence whose deaths would ripple across communities. He took care to kill during festivals or gatherings when there were witnesses to appreciate his work. He rarely repeated the exact same method, always adapting his tools and settings to suit the message he wished to send. He sometimes spared those who, by all rights, would have been easy targets, not out of mercy, but because their survival served the composition better. He spoke seldom during his performances, but when he did speak, his words were measured and poetic. He compared lives to notes, deaths to crescendos, silence to curtain calls. He was not insane in the sense that he lacked awareness. He was aware to a painful degree, attuned to every nuance of his actions and their effects. As years passed, the scars of war in Ionia slowly healed, but the fissures remained. Shen worked tirelessly to rebuild the Kinku and maintain harmony, traveling between villages to mediate disputes. Zed and his Order of Shadow continued their militant approach, eliminating threats before they could grow. Karma, the living vessel of the Ionian soul, advocated for balance and compassion. She understood the harm that vengeance could cause, but also the necessity of protecting her people. When Jhin struck a group of village elders who were advocating for pacifism, she mourned both them and the effect their deaths would have on the psyche of the First Lands. She saw how his art fractured communities and hardened hearts. She wanted to find him not simply to stop his killings, but to heal the wound he represented. Yet she also understood that some wounds fester because the causes are not addressed. Jhin was a symptom of something deeper, a consequence of neglect, war, and the complexities of human nature. There is an account of Jhin travelling to the plague jungles of Zorn to meet with a chemist who promised him a new compound that would create coloured flames. Such flames, the chemist said, would allow him to paint the night sky with his art. Jhin listened, intrigued. He had always loved colour. When he arrived at the chemist's hidden laboratory, he found it lined with vials and bubbling cauldrons. The smell of acrid chemicals filled the air. The chemist's eyes glowed with ambition. He spoke excitedly about how his compound would burn violet and gold, how crowds would marvel at the beauty. Jhin smiled politely and shot him on the fourth sentence. He walked through the lab, selecting vials at random, pouring them into a single container. He set the mixture near the edge of the city's canal and lit it as he walked away. The resulting explosion sent waves of colour cascading through the foggy air, reflecting in the polluted waters. Those who saw it were stunned by the spectacle. The alchemist's dream had come true, just not in the way he had expected. Jhin wrote a verse about it later, likening the colours to the dying embers of a performer's career. Throughout his travels, Jhin remained a solitary figure. He had no apprentices, no companions. He accepted commissions only when they suited his artistic needs. He sometimes wrote letters to his unseen patrons, thanking them for their support and subtly reminding them that art could not be rushed. He would not, he wrote, perform for the sake of politics alone. His creations had to mean something. In response, his patrons continued to fund him, perhaps because they feared what he would do if they tried to control him. They provided him with ammunition and information, leaving notes in predetermined locations. They may have thought they were using him, but he knew he was the one directing the play. Their resources were just another set of brushes and pigments. As the modern era dawned on Runeterra, with hextech innovations spreading and airships linking distant continents, Jhin considered expanding his performances beyond Ionia and Piltover. He read of Shuriman ruins where echoes lingered, of Freljordian festivals where stories were sung by firelight, of Targon where celestial beings descended, and of Bilgewater where pirates told tall tales. Each region offered unique stages. He imagined the way light would refract through the crystals of Mount Targon when a shot rang out. He envisioned the contrast of crimson blood against snow in the Freljord. He pondered how the scent of salt and rum in Bilgewater would interact with the smoke of his lotus bombs. He wrote outlines of performances, each tailored to the culture of its setting. He planned, for he knew that an unprepared artist was no artist at all. Yet, even as he imagined new canvases, he felt tethered to Ionia. The First Lands had birthed him, shaped his aesthetic and provided him with the number 4. The harmony of its temples and the chaos of its battlefields were the contrasting tones that defined his palette. He walked through bamboo groves, listening to the rustle of leaves as if they were applause. He sat by rivers that had once run red with Noxian blood, and recited the names of those he had killed, not out of guilt, but to keep score. He visited the ruins of theatres where he had once been a stagehand, running his gloved fingers over the worm-eaten wood. He stood unseen at festivals, watching performers whose lives he had once envied. He realized that he had surpassed them all. They played roles. He created them. In the quiet moments between performances, Jhin examined his philosophy. He had come to understand that art and murder were inextricably linked for him because both involved transformation. He transformed living beings into still lives. He transformed fear into awe. He transformed the mundane into the extraordinary. He did not see himself as cruel. Cruelty implied indifference or malicious glee. He was methodical, detached. He cared deeply about his work, about the way a body fell or the shape of a wound. He cared about the emotional journey of his audience. He did not kill for the sake of killing. He killed because without that finality, his art had no climax. He saw each life as a piece of clay. He shaped it, then fired it in the kiln of death, producing a permanent object. The story of Khada Jhin cannot end, for as long as he lives, he will continue to seek new stages. His art will evolve, reflecting the changing world. He may find new patrons or discard old ones. He may cross the ocean or ascend a mountain. He may one day stand face to face again with Shen and Zed, the men who first hunted him, and the resolution of that confrontation may be its own masterpiece. Perhaps Irelia will dance through his bullets once more. Perhaps Karma will speak to him of compassion, and he will listen long enough to compose a poem. Perhaps Caitlin will line up a shot across a Piltover street, unaware that he has already set the scene. These possibilities hang like lanterns waiting to be lit. Jhin, the virtuoso, takes comfort in knowing that as long as he breathes, there will be new audiences to astound and new victims to sculpt. And so, the tale of the Golden Demon continues to be told across Ionia. Travelers speak his name with fear and reluctant admiration. Parents warn their children to come home before dark, or the virtuoso will turn them into art. Soldiers sharpen their blades and practice their forms, hoping that if they ever cross his path, they might survive long enough to strike back. Monks meditate on the nature of evil and whether it is born or made. Artists argue about whether his work has merit independent of its horror. Some say that acknowledging beauty in his murders is to betray morality. Others say that refusing to see the artistry is to deny the complexity of human creation. Jhin himself is indifferent to these debates. He does not create for critics. He creates because he must. The curtain will rise, the shots will ring, and in the brief silence after the fourth shot, he will listen to the world breathe. Long before he earned the name Golden Demon, the nameless boy of Jhin lost himself in the folds of curtain cloth and the whisper of stage directions. The more seasoned performers ignored him, seeing only a pair of hands to carry instruments or adjust lanterns. He listened, always listening, to their stories of great heroes and villains, of tragedies that made grown men weep. In those tales, death was often an interruption, an end punctuated by a thunderclap or a scream. He began to collect the subtle moments that preceded those ends. the catching of a breath before a poisoned cup touched lips, the silence that fell across a crowd before an emperor was stabbed. Even as a child, he saw patterns where others saw only chaos. The idea that every life could be mapped like a performance took hold of him early, and he clung to it as if it were a lifeline in a river of indifference. The traveling troupe that sheltered him moved through the seasons as effortlessly as wind through bamboo. They slept under stars and within barn lofts, sharing meager meals and jokes that never aged. The boy seldom laughed, but he smiled when he watched the actors practice their roles in private. In those moments, he glimpsed vulnerability behind painted masks. He saw how self-doubt lurked beneath bravado. One night, he heard a veteran performer cry softly after forgetting his lines. Another time, he saw a dancer collapse from exhaustion after hours of rehearsing a single sequence. These scenes taught him that appearances deceived. The stagehand learned to read what was hidden between gestures and to focus on the spaces between notes. When the troupe visited a temple during a festival, he lingered before a statue of a serene spirit. The sculpture's smile was carved in stone, eternal and unchanging. Yet the boy imagined what the face looked like as clay. He imagined the process that transformed wet earth into revered art. He wanted to learn that process not with clay, but with living flesh. Among the troupe's possessions were a collection of masks used in different plays. Some were comic, with exaggerated grins and rosy cheeks. Others were tragic, with drooping eyes and painted tears. The boy handled them gently, tracing the contours with his fingers, feeling the grain of wood and the smoothness of lacquer. When no one was watching, he tried them on. Each mask changed the way he saw the world, narrowing his vision or widening it, altering the way sound reached his ears. Behind a mask, he felt freed from his own shyness. No one expected a stagehand to speak, but with a mask, his whispered lines were not his own. He wondered if he could craft a mask that hid not just his face, but his intentions. He doodled designs on scraps of paper, experimenting with shapes that would later become part of his signature persona. He was too young to know the word aesthetic, but he understood its essence. Life could be curated. As adolescence sharpened his features and lengthened his limbs, the boy's fascination with mortality intensified. He became adept at making himself invisible, using it to attend ceremonies he had no place in. If a villager died, he would slip into the funeral procession and observe everything: the arrangement of offerings, the cadence of the monks chanting, the way tears were wiped away discreetly with sleeves. When a young bride's husband fell from a cliff, he watched the widow wail until she fainted. He noted that the most authentic emotions were not those performed in front of the community, but those that spilled out when people thought they were alone. He stored these observations away like a collector of rare gems. Each insight was a polished stone he would one day set into the mosaic of his craft. Unlike other boys who dreamed of heroism or romance, he dreamed of orchestrating the perfect scream. He practiced on animals long before turning to humans. This fact is uncomfortable, but it is true. Curiosity, devoid of empathy, drove him. When he encountered a sparrow with a broken wing, he did not cradle it or seek to heal it. He watched its eyes dart as he moved his hand toward its breast. He felt the flutter of its heartbeat through its fragile bones. The moment he squeezed and stilled that heartbeat, he felt a spike of clarity. The fear he had sensed became his own exhilaration. He realized that life was a flame he could pinch out with 2 fingers. He sought out other such flames: a snake in a rice field, a cat caught between crates. Each death taught him something about timing and control. He discovered how to tilt a head so that blood would pool in a pattern he found pleasing. He learned that breath, like music, followed rhythms that could be disrupted. The world offered him 1,000 lessons, and he was an attentive pupil. When humans entered into his experiments, they were chosen with care. He did not kill indiscriminately at first. He selected those he believed would not be missed, or whose deaths would be attributed to accidents. A drunkard who beat his wife, a bandit whose blade had tasted blood. He justified it to himself, if only to explore moral boundaries he did not truly recognize. The first man he killed was asleep. He pressed a cloth soaked in soporific herbs over the man's face until his movements ceased. He waited, hand still covering the mouth, long after he knew the target was dead. Afterward, he felt an unexpected serenity. He had taken a life, and nothing had changed in the world. Birds still sang at dawn. Actors still practiced their lines. The sun rose over the terraced fields. Realizing how little consequence there was thrilled and angered him. He wanted death to matter. It would be his task to make it matter. While the boy plotted and refined his art, far away in the sacred groves of Navari, the Kinku order taught its students about equilibrium. Master Kusho lectured under flowering trees, explaining how the material and spirit realms interwove. He extolled harmony as both a goal and a practice. His young son, Shen, listened with a curiosity tempered by humor. Shen loved to tease his peers, to lighten heavy lessons with jokes, but he took his studies seriously. The orphaned Zed, found and trained by Kusho, possessed a ferocity that he channeled into discipline. He sought approval through perfection. These 3 would one day cross paths with the nameless boy, but for now they meditated under different skies, unaware of the threads the universe would weave between them. Kusho's duties took him across Ionia, visiting shrines to commune with spirits and settling disputes between villages. On one such journey, he heard rumors of grotesque displays near Jhin. Farmers spoke of corpses arranged like puppets and rituals defiled. Kusho listened with his usual calm, but felt unease stirring beneath his breastbone. He had dealt with many entities that troubled the balance, restless ghosts, petty demons, corrupted mages, but the meticulous cruelty described did not fit any known pattern. At first, he assumed it was the work of a malevolent spirit. Spirits were bound by rules. There were ceremonies to banish them, to coax them back into their realm. If this was a spirit, it was one he had not met. He sent word back to the temple and prepared to investigate. When Kusho, Shen, and Zed arrived in the afflicted region, the stench of death clung to the air like heavy incense. Their path was lined with lanterns swaying in the wind, some bearing dried blood. They visited the site of a recent killing first. 4 bodies lay on a hillside, their limbs carefully placed, their faces covered with theatrical masks. Kusho closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He could feel the lingering energy of fear. Shen cracked a joke to break the tension, but his voice sounded strained. Zed remained silent, his jaw clenched. They studied the scene without touching it. Each detail revealed something about the killer's intention. The alignment of the bodies pointed toward a lone pine tree. The masks were arranged in ascending order of sadness. A poem had been written on rice paper and pinned to one victim's sleeve. Its lines referenced the changing seasons and the inevitability of decay. Kusho realized that this was not a spirit's chaotic hunger. This was design. As months turned to years, the hunt consumed them. They rode through rain and snow, tracking rumors like hunters following hoofprints. They questioned hermits, merchants, and soldiers. They found more scenes. In one, 4 fishermen were tied to stakes in a marsh, their bodies facing each other, their mouths filled with reeds that produced hollow whistles as wind passed through. Kusho marveled at the practicality and perversity. The killer had turned a swamp into an instrument. Shen gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, then steadied himself. Zed's fists shook, not with fear, but with anger. The patterns became more intricate with each kill. The killer was evolving, using new props, exploring new symbolism. It frustrated Zed and fascinated Kusho. How could a human be so cold? Kusho wrestled with the desire to see the murderer as a demon so he could hate him without complication. The truth that this was a man forced him to acknowledge the capacity for darkness in all of them. There were times when they believed they were close. In one village, they found a set of footprints that led into a bamboo thicket. They followed them, moving silently, only to emerge at a clearing where 4 scarecrows stood around a fire pit. Each scarecrow wore the outfit of a different profession: farmer, soldier, merchant, monk. Their straw hands were tied together. Kusho understood the message immediately. The killer was mocking them. He was saying that he could be anyone among them. Shen cursed softly. Zed slashed at one of the scarecrows, decapitating it. The straw head rolled to Kusho's feet. He picked it up and saw that inside was a doll carved from wood, resembling a child's toy. This juxtaposition of innocence and horror haunted him for nights afterward. During these years, the boy watched his hunters as much as they watched him. He learned their patterns as they tried to decipher his. He appreciated their persistence. Persistence was a quality he admired in artists and predators alike. He arranged scenes not only for villagers, but for Kusho, Shen, and Zed. He left clues he knew Zed would find, and he delighted when those clues filled the young man with rage. Rage was a raw emotion, useful in creation, but dangerous when uncontrolled. He observed Kusho's calm and felt a flicker of respect. Kusho approached each crime scene with a reverence that mirrored the boy's own attention to detail. Shen's humor irritated him. Humor, he thought, had no place where art and death mingled. The boy began to incorporate elements he knew would unsettle each of them. A mask with a crack down its middle, mirroring Zed's inner conflict. A serene Buddha painted in blood, challenging Kusho's spirituality. A joke written in fine calligraphy, testing Shen's ability to laugh in the face of horror. The capture at Gion Pass was, from the boy's perspective, a performance he had not expected to participate in. He had gone to the festival not to kill, but to watch. Spirit Blossom had always fascinated him, the air filled with perfumes, the trees glowing with lanterns. It was an environment he might have used as a stage. Instead, he found himself the subject. When Kusho's gaze locked onto him, he felt a surge of adrenaline akin to what he felt before a kill. Being seen was a new sensation. For so long, he had been a phantom, a rumor. He weighed his options. Running would cause a scene, and he disliked chaos he could not choreograph. Fighting in the middle of a crowd risked harming those not meant to die yet. Surrender was an act in itself. He decided to yield, to play along in this new performance, trusting his ability to pivot as the script demanded. He told them his name not because he cared to share it, but because names have power. By giving them his, he bound them to him. Tola was nothing like he expected. He imagined dark cells and chains. Instead, he found corridors open to the sea breeze, gardens where prisoners raked sand into ripples, and halls where monks read poetry aloud. The discipline was strict, but the cruelty was absent. The boy, now a young man, adapted quickly. He followed schedules, meditated when told, and recited prayers he did not believe. He did not do so to reform. He did so to learn. The monastery's library was open to him under supervision. He devoured scrolls on philosophy, history, and theatre. He read about the cycle of life, about karma and rebirth. He laughed silently at the idea that karma would someday cause his own suffering. He did not believe in cosmic retribution. He believed in human hands shaping fate. One monk, old and patient, took an interest in him. The monk, who had once been a warrior before taking vows, recognized a familiar tension in the young man's shoulders. He approached him during meditation and, without prompting, said, "Art can be a bridge between worlds. It can heal." The young man nodded politely but internally scoffed. He did not need healing. The monk persisted, bringing him brushes and ink, encouraging him to paint. At first, the young man painted predictable scenes, a mountain in mist, a koi fish leaping from water. The monk praised them, then asked, "What does your heart wish to paint?" The question irritated him. If he painted what his heart desired, the monastery would crumble. Instead, he painted a single stroke across white paper, dark and bold, then another parallel to it, 4 strokes in all, each identical. The monk bowed and said nothing. The young man smiled beneath his neutral expression. He had expressed himself perfectly. As years passed, he forged relationships with tools rather than people. The monastery's small forge was meant for making farming implements or repairing ceremonial bells. Under the guise of crafting writing brushes, he experimented with metals, learning their melting points and temperaments. He spoke with blacksmiths who visited to deliver supplies, asking about alloys. He filed and sanded, hammered and quenched. The rhythm of striking metal echoed the rhythm of his future shots. When he heard of a new technology, gunpowder imported from far lands, he was intrigued. He studied it academically at first, reading treatises on its uses in fireworks and warfare. Then he began to imagine how it could be incorporated into his own art. The monastery had no guns. Such weapons were rare and distrusted in Ionia. He drew designs anyway, combining the elegance of a flute with the lethality of a cannon. He dreamed of a weapon that could produce both sound and death. News of the Noxian invasion reached Tula like distant thunder. Travelers spoke of armies crossing Ionian plains, of monasteries burned and villages enslaved. The elders debated whether to close their gates or join the fight. Ultimately, they chose to focus on spiritual defense, trusting others to hold the physical line. This decision stirred resentment among some young monks who felt it cowardly. The young man listened to these debates with interest. If the world was changing, opportunities would arise. He began to think of his art on a broader scale. War created chaos, and chaos demanded a response. The boy who had once arranged corpses in fields dreamed of designing spectacles that entire armies might witness. The day strangers came for him, He sensed them before he saw them. The air outside Tula's gate carried a different tension. The elders received the strangers with the wariness reserved for those bearing authority. The young man was summoned to the main hall. Papers were read, seals inspected. The elders whispered among themselves. Then they turned to him and said, "You are released into their custody." There was no explanation. The young man bowed, his face a mask of gratitude, and walked out without looking back. He did not thank the monks for their hospitality. Hospitality was not part of the art he valued. On the winding path away from Tula, the strangers remained silent. They were cloaked, their faces shadowed. The sound of his footsteps and the creak of his leather shoes mixed with the distant roar of the ocean below. Eventually, one handed him a case. He opened it as reverently as a monk opens a sacred text. Inside lay the object he had imagined countless times. It was exquisitely crafted, its wood polished to a deep sheen, its metal shining with the promise of violence. When he lifted it, he felt its weight and balance. It had 4 barrels. It was a gun and a cane, a tool and a prop. Tears pricked his eyes, not from emotion but from the perfection of it. He wanted to test it immediately, but he waited. Anticipation is part of performance. As soon as he was truly alone, he tested the weapon. He chose a grove of bamboo where the sound would be swallowed by leaves. He loaded each barrel slowly, enjoying the click of metal, the smell of powder. He aimed at a distant rock and fired. The explosion rang out, louder than any drum. The bullet struck the rock and sent shards flying. He fired again, then again, then again. Each shot felt like releasing a tightly coiled spring in his chest. He laughed, a high sound he had not heard from himself in years. This instrument would allow him to paint with distance, to control not just space but time. It would be the spine of his future compositions. To craft his mask, he sought inspiration from the faces he had studied in his youth. He carved wood, rejecting piece after piece until he found one with a fine, even grain. He shaped it into a smooth oval, leaving the eyes as narrow slits. He added gold filigree, not for ostentation but for contrast against the white lacquer. He placed it on his face and looked into a pond, seeing for the first time the absence of his own features. He was both no one and someone new. He selected clothing that allowed for movement and elegance. Flowing sleeves could conceal gun barrels. Sashes could hide bullets and bombs. He adopted a cane's tap as part of his rhythm. From that moment on, he was Jhin, the Virtuoso. His first performance after release was as much a test for himself as for his audience. He needed to reintroduce himself to the world. He chose a secluded village because it allowed him to control variables. He studied the family he selected for days, watching their routines, learning the creak of their gait and the lullabies they sang. On the night of the performance, he moved through their home with familiarity. He shot each person once, quick and clean. The real work began after death. He positioned them around their table with care, curling fingers around cups, adjusting hair so that it fell gracefully. He set the youngest child's head against her father's shoulder. He lit a lantern to cast warm light over the tableau. Then he left, taking nothing but the memory of the arrangement. When the neighbors discovered the scene, their screams were shrill and perfect. He listened, hidden in tall grass, and closed his eyes in pleasure. Encouraged, he sought more ambitious stages. The story of the steel cane was the next step. It began with a blacksmith who lived near the border, renowned for crafting ceremonial weapons. Jhin, though he no longer thought of himself by his old name, approached the smith disguised as a weary traveller. He leaned heavily on his cane, masking its true function. He spoke in a cracked voice, asking for help repairing his walking stick. The blacksmith, a proud man with a rough beard and strong hands, took the cane, admired its craftsmanship, and asked where it had been made. Jhin invented a story about a distant land, peppering it with details to make it believable. While the smith examined the cane, Jhin observed the workshop. Tools hung from pegs. Embers glowed in the forge. The air smelled of oil and iron. He noted the positions of the blacksmith's assistants, 3 men who moved with the casual confidence of those who had fought before. They watched him with mild suspicion. He smiled inwardly. 4 targets. Perfect. He waited for the right moment. He told the blacksmith he would return in the morning for his repaired cane. He spent the night perched in a tree overlooking the workshop, listening to the rhythm of hammers on anvils. He wrote a poem in his mind about steel's journey from ore to blade. At dawn he returned, leaning even more heavily on his cane to sell his disguise. The blacksmith greeted him warmly, oblivious. Jhin asked about the man's work and complimented the artistry of the blades on display. The blacksmith boasted, taking down a curved sword to show its balance. When he turned, Jhin shot him through the chest. The shot was so quick and so quiet that the assistants did not realize what had happened until their master fell forward, scattering sparks. Jhin pivoted, firing his second shot at the assistant nearest the door. He fired the third at the man who had reached for a hammer. He waited a heartbeat, savoring the tension, then fired the fourth at the last assistant as the man lunged toward him. 4 shots, 4 bodies. The workshop filled with the tang of blood and smoke. He did not leave immediately. He set the bodies against the forge as if warming themselves. He placed the sword still clutched in the blacksmith's hand across his lap. He wiped his fingerprints from the cane and reopened the hidden compartment where the barrels were concealed. He placed a lotus bomb in the forge's coals, knowing it would ignite when someone attempted to relight the fire. Then he scrawled a verse on the anvil in chalk. Steel sings when touched by flame, flesh sings when touched by lead. He left the door ajar. Hours later, when the blacksmith's apprentice who had been in the village returned, he found the scene and screamed. The subsequent ignition of the bomb sent shards of glowing metal and petals into the air. Villagers spoke of how beautiful and horrifying the sight was. They would remember it forever. That was Jhin's intention. He used similar methods in other performances, each tailored to the subject. In the Zed comics, his kidnapping of Akali's master displayed his flair for baiting his old enemies. He had learned that the Order of Shadow had taken control of certain compounds, and that Akali, the famous rogue assassin, occasionally visited. He waited until Zed and his warriors were away, then infiltrated the compound disguised as a servant. He moved with the studied unimportance of someone who belonged. He drugged the tea of the guards, waited until they slumped, then carried the unconscious master to a hidden room. He left behind a single lotus petal, a signature, and a challenge. When Zed returned and found his mentor missing, rage clouded his judgment. Jhin anticipated this. He sent a message through a panicked servant inviting Zed to a theatre at dusk. He chose an abandoned opera house overgrown with vines and illuminated by shafts of sunset. Every board creaked. Dust motes danced in beams of light. Zed arrived, blades drawn, eyes scanning the shadows. Jhin watched from the rafters, his heart beating with the rhythm he had set. He had positioned 4 mannequins on the stage, each dressed in the garb of a different Kinku discipline. He had tied the kidnapped master to a chair at the center. He waited until Zed drew near, then flicked a switch that caused the mannequins to spring to life. They were not spirits, but mechanical constructs, a toy he had purchased from a Piltovian tinkerer. They moved jerkily, their wooden arms swinging swords. Zed destroyed them quickly, anger fueling his movements. Each time a mannequin fell, a lotus bomb hidden within it exploded, showering petals and splinters. Jhin appreciated the image of Zed slicing through flowers and wood. Finally, he stepped into view on a balcony above, his mask gleaming. He spoke in measured tones, comparing the Kinku to puppets and himself to a playwright. Zed threw a blade, but Jhin dodged. He aimed his gun at the master and, in front of Zed, shot him. The man slumped. Jhin bowed and disappeared through a hidden passage. He left Zed with the realization that he had once again been too slow. That realization was part of the art. Jin's travels to Piltover and Zaun opened new possibilities. Piltover's gleaming towers and orderly streets contrasted sharply with the organic chaos of Ionia's forests. He found the city both sterile and fascinating. Hextech crystals glowed in lanterns. Automata carried goods across bridges. Merchants wore goggles stained with grease. Jhin walked among them unseen, one more foreigner in a city of diversity. He attended a performance at the Opera of Light, noting the acoustics and the timing of curtain drops. He was there to kill a shipping magnate who exploited both Zolnite workers and Ionian refugees. He studied the man's schedule and learned that he never missed a particular aria sung by a famous soprano. Jhin arranged to stand in the opposite box, disguised as a gentleman with a white scarf. At the climax of the aria, when the soprano held a note that made even the chandeliers vibrate, Jhin raised his cane, aimed across the theatre, and fired. The shot travelled unseen through the darkness, striking the magnate through his left eye. The man slumped without a sound, blending in with the enthralled audience. Jhin sat back and enjoyed the rest of the opera. No one realized what had happened until intermission, when gasps rippled through the hall like an aftershock. The juxtaposition of beauty and death satisfied him. Zaun presented a different stage. Its undercity was thick with fumes and shadows. People there seldom looked up, their eyes focused on the ground to avoid stepping in refuse or falling into open grates. Jhin moved through its tunnels like a ghost. He targeted a chem baron known for flooding neighborhoods with addictive serums. He infiltrated the baron's laboratory disguised as a client. He complimented the baron on his ingenuity, his ability to harness chemicals to alter emotions. The baron, flattered, showed him the latest formula, a vial of shimmering green liquid that promised to instill euphoria. Jhin accepted the vial graciously, then smashed it on the floor as he shot the man's guards. He shot the baron last, just as the man's mouth opened to protest. The fourth shot ignited the chemicals on the floor, sending green flames licking up the walls. Jhin walked calmly through the ensuing chaos, flames casting his shadow large on the smoke. Outside, he climbed to a rooftop and watched as the laboratory erupted in a column of color. He wrote a stanza about it later, comparing the flames to the auroras he had only read about in books. Throughout his journeys, he never formed attachments. People were brushes and pigments. He used them to create. Patrons were benefactors, not friends. He met with them in dim rooms, faces obscured by screens, their voices careful. They offered names and sums. He accepted or declined based on whether the commission fit his vision. When they pushed him to hurry, he reminded them that all great art takes time. When they attempted to withhold payment, he reminded them through a demonstration on one of their bodyguards that art can also be sudden. They learned to respect his process. They also learned to fear him. His interactions with figures like Karma revealed the limits of his philosophy. In one tale, he infiltrated a temple that Karma was visiting. He intended to kill a council member present, a man whose policies had led to suffering. He planned to do so during a ritual meditation. He crept into the temple, positioning himself behind a lattice screen. He listened to Karma lead a group in a chant, her voice resonant and soothing. As he prepared to pull the trigger, he found himself distracted by her words. She spoke of cycles, of pain leading to growth, of compassion being a strength. He hesitated. It was the rarest of moments, a pause not engineered by him, but by another. He fired anyway, hitting his target. Karma's head snapped in his direction, her eyes meeting his through the screen. In them, he did not see fear. He saw sadness. He withdrew quickly, his heart beating faster than usual. He pondered the encounter for days. He wondered if art could exist without cruelty. He concluded it could not, but the moment remained with him, like a note that hung in the air long after the music ended. His duel with Irelia was equally charged. He admired her as a dancer before he feared her as a warrior. He had watched her perform with her blades, each movement a blend of attack and artistry. When he decided to target her, it was as much an homage as an elimination. He lured her to a plaza by assassinating a local magistrate and leaving a message only she would understand, a scrap of cloth embroidered with a design from her home province. She arrived, blades orbiting her like satellites, expression calm but alert. He stepped from the shadows, mask catching the light. He spoke of dance and death, quoting an ancient poem. She replied with caution, trying to appeal to any remaining humanity in him. He listened, not out of respect, but because her voice was melodious. Then he raised his cane and fired. She moved, blades slicing the air, intercepting the bullet. Lotus bombs he had hidden in planters exploded, sending shards of pottery and petals into the air. The two circled each other, their movements a duet of destruction. He recognized the beauty in her footwork, the way she pivoted and turned. He aimed his shots not to kill immediately, but to guide her into positions he found aesthetically pleasing. She recognized his manipulation and countered. Eventually he retreated, leaving behind a square covered in petals and scorch marks. He called the performance incomplete. She called it a warning. As the years advanced and technology evolved, Jhin remained both ancient and modern. He refused to replace his cane gun with Hextech versions offered by Piltover's inventors. He appreciated advancements, but was loyal to his instrument. He did, however, incorporate new elements into his art. He learned about sound amplification and used hidden horns to project screams across larger distances. He experimented with colored powders to tint smoke different shades. He studied the psychology of audiences through Piltover's emerging theater theory. He read Zionite studies on brain chemistry, not to heal, but to manipulate responses. He sought to perfect his craft, not by adhering to tradition, but by blending it with innovation. In this, he mirrored Runeterra itself, a world where ancient magic and new technology coexisted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. In quiet moments when no commission occupied him, he wrote. He wrote not confessions, but treatises on art. He wrote about the importance of timing, about the need for contrast, about the role of the audience in completing a work. He argued with himself on parchment, exploring whether the fear he elicited detracted from or enhanced the beauty he created. He questioned whether he could ever reveal his face and still have his art appreciated. He concluded that anonymity was essential. A known identity would humanize him, and humanity would dilute the purity of his work. He occasionally burned his writings after finishing them, enjoying the sight of ink turning to smoke. Other times he hid them in compartments of his cane, perhaps hoping someone would find them after his death and debate them. The idea of being debated pleased him. Those who pursued him changed over the decades. Jhin remained steadfast, his sense of duty undiminished. He tried different strategies, setting traps, using decoys, appealing to Jhin's sense of pride. He had come to understand that catching Jhin required understanding his art. Zed, hardened by war and guilt, continued his shadowy campaign. He sent assassins after Jhin, training them specifically to counter the Virtuoso's tendencies. Some came close. One managed to graze Jhin's mask with a shuriken, leaving a scratch that Jhin later filled with gold, integrating the imperfection into the design. For Jhin, the scratch became a reminder of the thin line between control and chaos. He found it poetic. Akali, grown into her own legend, sought him not only to avenge her master, but to end a threat to her people. She came closest when she infiltrated one of his workshops. She saw sketches of future performances pinned to walls, notes on lighting and sound. She understood then the depth of his obsession. He escaped through a concealed door, leaving her in a room filled with eerie silence. She never forgot the feeling of standing in his creative space, as if she had intruded on a sacred shrine. Caitlin and other law enforcers from Piltover entered the hunt as his fame crossed oceans. They brought analytical minds and mechanical tools to bear. They studied ballistics, matched bullets to his gun, and calculated trajectories. They interviewed witnesses across continents. Caitlin, in particular, understood the mind of a shooter. She admired good marksmanship. She was repulsed by his killings, but could not deny the precision. She set traps using decoys, anticipating his pattern of 4. He admired her methodical nature from afar. He once left her a note pinned to a corpse. "Your aim is true, but do you hear the music?" She took it as a challenge. Their cat and mouse game spanned years, each encounter raising the stakes. Neither could fully grasp the other's driving force. That tension was, again, part of the art. The world told and retold his story, each iteration adding embellishments or stripping away nuance. In some villages, he became a cautionary tale used to frighten children into obedience. Parents whispered, "If you don't behave, the mask will come for you." In cities, he became a symbol of rebellion. His assassinations of corrupt officials celebrated secretly in songs. playwrights borrowed his motifs, staging tragedies with 4 acts. Painters depicted lotus flowers and masks in their canvases. Philosophers used him as a case study in discussions about the nature of evil and art. He listened, unseen, to these interpretations and smiled. Once, he attended a play inspired by one of his killings. The actor portraying him wore an exaggerated mask and spoke in a sinister whisper. The audience laughed nervously. Jhin left at intermission, both amused and annoyed. No one could truly play him but him. Despite the years, some things never changed. He still favored the number 4. He still chose festivals and celebrations as stages. He still wrote poetry that only a few ever read. He still adhered to a code known only to him. Yet, within this framework, he allowed himself variation. He experimented with silence, sometimes killing without leaving any visual arrangement, forcing those who found the bodies to imagine the unseen composition. He reversed expectations, sparing a target and killing a bystander to create dissonance. He once staged a performance with no deaths at all, simply placing 4 empty coffins in a square with a single lotus in each. The speculation that followed among locals entertained him. Art, he understood, was sometimes in the suggestion rather than the act. In one of his later performances, he returned to his roots in Jhin. He wanted to close a circle, to revisit the valley where he had first arranged bodies. He found the village changed by time, new houses built, children grown, old storytellers now gone. He walked among the market stalls, listening to merchants haggle, inhaling the scent of grilled sweet potatoes. He passed by the stage where the troupe he once served had performed. It had been rebuilt, its wood fresher, but its design the same. For a moment he felt an echo of his childhood, a sensation of watching from behind a curtain. He decided not to kill anyone that day. Instead, he left a bouquet of lotus flowers on the stage, 4 blooms tied with a silk ribbon. Attached was a note that read, "An intermission before the finale." The villagers puzzled over it, the elders telling children tales of the golden demon. Jhin listened from afar, his heart beating with unfamiliar softness. Nostalgia, he realized, was an emotion he had seldom indulged. He allowed himself to feel it briefly before turning it into fuel for his next work. His future performances remain unwritten in history, but exist fully formed in his mind. He has imagined a piece on the slopes of Mount Targon, where a shot fired at just the right moment might echo between peaks and reverberate like a drum roll. He has plotted a piece in a Freljordian mead hall, where blood on snow would stand out like ink on parchment. He dreams of boarding a bilgewater ship during a revelry, disguising himself among pirates, then turning the deck into a stage. Each idea waits patiently until the time is right. He believes deeply in timing. Rushing a performance ruins it. Waiting too long dulls its edge. He reads the world, its politics and its weather, the way a musician reads sheet music. He senses when chords align. Even if he never performs those imagined pieces, the possibility of them feeds him. Potential energy is energy nonetheless. He knows that someday his art will conclude. Perhaps it will be at the hands of Shen, who still walks the path of equilibrium. Perhaps Zed will finally strike the killing blow he desired years ago. Perhaps a nameless soldier will fire a lucky arrow. Or perhaps Jhin will dictate his own curtain call, crafting a final performance in which he is both artist and subject. He has considered the symbolism of such an ending. He imagines staging his own death in 4 acts, each act revealing a truth about his life. He has written possible scripts, then torn them up, unwilling to commit yet. The unknown enthralls him. It keeps his finger poised on a trigger, his mind turning like the spool of a musical box. Until that final scene, he continues to walk through the world with his cane tapping, his mask gleaming. He watches children play and couples argue, soldiers march and elders pray. He sees the art in everything, in the arc of a thrown ball, in the curve of a smile, in the furrow of a brow. He stores these images away, cataloguing them not with labels but with feelings. When he pulls the trigger, he summons them, combining them in ways that make his art resonate. He never tires of the gasp that follows the 4th shot. He never stops listening for the breathless hush that falls when an audience is captivated. He is addicted not to death, but to reaction. In a way, he is no different from the stagehand he once was, hoping to be seen and heard in a world that seldom noticed him. The difference is that now the world cannot look away. Before the boy ever touched a weapon, he learned to touch strings. The troupe's musician, a kindly man with calloused fingers, took pity on the quiet child and showed him how to pluck a koto. The instrument's long body and silk strings produced notes that lingered in the air like breath on a cold morning. The boy's hands were steady. He pressed and released, exploring how variations in pressure altered tone. The musician taught him simple songs, then more complex pieces. Music, the boy realized, had structure much like death. There was a beginning, a build-up, a climax, and a resolution. He internalized rhythm not through clapping games or dance, but through the reverberation of strings. The vibrations traveled through the wood and into his chest. They trained his fingers, but more importantly, they trained his sense of timing. Years later, when he squeezed a trigger, that sense of timing ensured his shots landed at the precise moment he intended. Calligraphy, too, became part of his repertoire. While other stagehands were told to wash costumes, he took to cleaning the brushes used to paint backdrops. He noticed how each brush held ink differently, how the thickness of a line depended on the angle of the wrist and the pressure applied. Once, after everyone had gone to bed, he dipped a brush in leftover ink and wrote his name on a piece of rice paper. The strokes were clumsy, and the ink bled. Dissatisfied, he practiced again and again, copying the characters he saw on scrolls hanging in temples. Calligraphy was revered as the embodiment of the writer's soul. A single character could convey strength or grace or rage. He aspired to the level of precision where each stroke matched the next, forming patterns so uniform that they lost their individuality. He loved the idea of uniformity. When he later carved his mask, he thought of his brush strokes, each groove purposeful. The discipline he gained from calligraphy contributed to his ability to hold his hand steady regardless of emotion. His work would not suffer from tremors of fear or excitement. His strokes, whether on paper or flesh, would be deliberate. When Kusho decided to spare Jhin at Jeon Pass, the decision rippled through the Kinku like a stone dropped into water. Zed, whose anger had been simmering for years, felt his blood boil. He had followed every trail, examined every corpse, inhaled the stench of death for 4 years. He had dreamed of ending the killer with his own hands. He did not understand Kusho's reasoning. He confronted his master privately, voice barely contained. "He's human," Kusho said. "We do not execute humans without trial. Zed argued that sparing a human who acted like a demon endangered humanity. Shen stood between them, trying to mediate, but his own feelings were conflicted. He trusted his father, yet he had seen the horrors. The disagreement marked a fracture. In that moment, the seeds of the Order of Shadow were sown. Zed believed that the Kinku's adherence to tradition made them weak. Jhin did not witness this confrontation, but its consequences shaped the world he returned to. The chaos of war and the rise of radicalism created the perfect environment for his art to flourish. In Tula, time warped. Days were measured by bells and bowls of rice, not by kills or arrangements. Jhin took to walking the perimeter of the monastery, counting his steps, feeling the texture of stones under his sandals. He would pause at certain points to watch the ocean crash against cliffs far below. The endless churning of waves reminded him of the endless cycle of life and death. He envied the waves their power. He once asked a monk, "If a wave destroys a boat, is it cruel?" The monk replied, "A wave is part of the ocean. Cruelty requires intent." Jhin smiled politely. He thought, "I am both ocean and wave." He sat under a cherry tree, watching petals fall and scatter. The randomness irritated him. He wished he could control the fall of each petal, could decide which blade of grass it would land on. In his mind, he arranged them, envisioning patterns that made sense. Such fantasies sustained him during his confinement. The fellow prisoners at Tula included mages who had lost control, soldiers who had committed atrocities, and individuals whose minds had been fractured by spirit possession. Jhin observed them the way a doctor observes symptoms. He listened to their muttered confessions and their fits of laughter. One prisoner, a former dancer driven mad by the voices of spirits, spun endlessly in the courtyard, his feet bleeding. Jhin approached him once and asked why he danced. The man answered, "If I stop, they will catch me." When Jhin asked who they were, the man whispered, "The eyes that watch." Jhin looked up at the monastery's eaves, noting carved dragons with gaping mouths. He wondered if he was an eye to someone else. He left the dancer to his spinning. Later, when he staged performances, he remembered that endless spin and incorporated it into the turning of his victims' bodies. Everything he witnessed became material. The strangers who freed him were likely agents of high-ranking Ionian officials. Though their faces were hidden, their speech patterns betrayed their upbringing. They spoke with the cadence of bureaucrats, the courtesy of diplomats. Jhin understood that politics were at play. The Ionian Council, desperate after the invasion, sought weapons beyond their traditions. They viewed him as a tool, a means to an end. He viewed them as patrons, as financiers of his craft. In the stillness before his release, he imagined conversations in the halls of power. "We cannot fight Noxus with swords alone. Karma will not condone dark measures, but desperate times require desperate artists." He laughed internally at the thought of being discussed as art. When the case containing his cane gun was placed in his hands, he did not feel gratitude. He felt validation. Even the powerful recognized that his talent could not be suppressed forever. One of Jhin's most intricate early performances after his release targeted 4 Ionian generals meeting in secret to decide the allocation of troops. The meeting took place in a tea house built of cedar and paper, perched over a koi pond. Guards surrounded the building, their armor polished, their spears sharp. Jhin spent days disguised as a gardener, trimming bushes and raking gravel. He listened to the guards' conversations, learning their shifts and their gossip. He noticed that one guard had a sweet tooth and always carried candied plums. He noticed that the koi were fed just after noon, causing a distraction as the fish splashed. He filed away these details. On the day of the meeting, he served tea in porcelain cups decorated with lotus motifs. He had replaced the handles of 4 cups with explosive shells disguised as ceramic. Each handle contained a tiny mechanism that would detonate when twisted 4 times, a polite gesture in Ionian tea etiquette. Jhin bowed as he handed out the cups, mask hidden under a gardener's hat. The generals, lost in discussion of flanking maneuvers and supply lines, did not look up. They lifted their cups with both hands, twisted the handles 4 times, and died simultaneously when the explosions tore through porcelain, bone, and brain. The blasts were contained enough to prevent damage to the tea house, but the shock waves knocked over scrolls and shattered ink stones. Guards rushed in, weapons drawn, but found only a room filled with steam, blood, and petals. Jhin had already slipped through a hidden panel, leaving behind a calligraphed note. Even planning requires stagecraft. The assassination threw the Ionian command into disarray, and his patrons sent him more work. Another performance during this period targeted a Noxian warlord stationed in Ionia. The man was known for his cruelty and his love of imported wine. Jhin infiltrated the warlord's camp disguised as a traveling merchant selling exotic spirits. He displayed bottles filled with liquids of varying hues. The warlord, intrigued, purchased 4 bottles immediately. Jhin offered to perform a tasting, pouring the wine into 4 goblets lined with fine gold. He had hidden a small amount of volatile powder in each goblet, disguised as sediment. When the warlord and his 3 lieutenants raised their goblets in a toast, the wine ignited as it touched their lips. Flames erupted, engulfing their faces and throats. They thrashed and fell, spilling burning wine across maps and plans. Soldiers panicked, thinking they were under magical attack. Jhin calmly packed his remaining wares and left the camp amid the chaos, his mask hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wrote a brief poem about the taste of fire on the tongue and sent it anonymously to a Noxian poet. The poet published it, never knowing its origin. As his reputation grew, Jhin found that people began to study him, not just his hunters, but also scholars and artists. A group of young playwrights in Wehel wrote a play exploring the moral implications of his art. They argued that by forcing society to confront the horror of death, he held up a mirror. In the play, a masked actor delivered monologues about beauty and decay, while others debated whether to appreciate or condemn him. The play was banned after its first performance. The ban only increased its allure. Copies circulated secretly, and the dialogues influenced a generation of Ionian artists. Jhin attended a performance in disguise and felt both pride and irritation. They had misunderstood his intentions. He did not kill to teach lessons. He killed to create reaction. Yet the fact that his work inspired other art pleased him. Art begets art. He left a note under the playwright's door. You misheard the melody, but at least you listened. One of his later compositions combined elements of music, explosives, and architecture. It took place in a mountain temple dedicated to a minor spirit of echoes. Pilgrims came to the temple to shout their wishes into a cavern and listen for the spirit's response. Jhin visited and noticed how sounds traveled differently in the space. He conceived of a performance that would utilize those acoustics. He planted small charges in 4 corners of the cavern, each tuned to a different pitch. He lured 4 corrupt merchants to the temple by promising them a rare artifact for their illegal trade. Once inside, he guided them to stand in positions that aligned with the charges. He then fired his weapon in sequence, each shot timed so that the echoes overlapped and created a haunting chord. The shots killed the merchants, their bodies collapsing in positions reminiscent of supplicants. The echoes of gunfire reverberated for several minutes, bouncing off the cavern walls, mingling with the explosions of the charges. Pilgrims outside thought the spirit was angry. The temple closed for weeks. During that time, Jhin received a letter from an unknown admirer praising the composition. He burned the letter without reading the signature. Admiration was a given. While in Zaan, Jhin experimented with chemicals to produce new visual effects. He consulted with a reclusive alchemist known only as Plague's Muse, who specialized in creating dyes that changed color depending on temperature. Jhin commissioned a batch of powders that would shift from pale blue to deep purple when ignited. He tested them in an abandoned warehouse, arranging canisters at different heights and distances. When he ignited them with a single shot, they exploded in cascading clouds of color. The smoke drifted in layers, producing a living painting that changed as it cooled. He imagined using such effects during a performance timed with a sunrise or sunset. The idea of painting the sky with death thrilled him. He thanked the alchemist by leaving behind 4 vials of his own mixture, a toxin that induced vivid hallucinations before killing. He never learned whether she used them. Jhin's interactions with his patrons became more theatrical over time. They met him in elaborate disguises, fearing recognition. One patron wore a fox mask and spoke through a translator to avoid revealing his accent. He asked Jhin to eliminate a rival in exchange for a fortune. Jhin asked what the rival had done. The patron listed petty grievances, unfair tariffs, slighted honor, whispered insults. Jhin declined. He did not kill over wounded pride alone. Another patron, a woman whose family had been impoverished by war, asked Jhin to avenge her husband by killing the general responsible for conscripting him. Jhin accepted, not out of sympathy, but because the general's public persona offered a challenging stage. He appreciated patrons who brought him worthy compositions. When patrons attempted to manipulate him, he reminded them who controlled the narrative by staging small performances that hinted at what he could do to them. They learned quickly. There were moments when Jhin felt something akin to envy. He watched villagers share a meal and laugh, saw lovers hold hands under blossoming trees, heard children sing songs as they skipped stones across streams. He could appreciate the beauty in those scenes, but he could not feel a part of them. His art required distance. To engage fully would contaminate his perspective. He sometimes wondered what his life would have been if someone had noticed the stagehand and offered him a different path. The thought flickered like a candle in a breeze and was snuffed out by his own certainty. He was not a victim of circumstance. He was an embodiment of choice. Still, those fleeting moments of envy fueled his desire to create even more transcendent art. If he could not belong, he would be remembered. Immortality through fear was better than anonymity through kindness. In his solitary workshops, He designed lotus bombs with the same care jewelers used when setting gems. He selected petals from specific ponds, choosing those with the right thickness and hue. He dried them using methods learned from apothecaries so that they retained their color. He folded them around explosive cores with nimble fingers. He experimented with shapes, spheres that rolled, discs that stuck to surfaces, strings of small bombs that unfurled like garlands when thrown. He soaked wicks in perfumes so that the first sign of danger was a pleasant scent. He tested different powders for color and sound. He kept detailed notes, adjusting variables like a scientist. When he lit a fuse, he watched the flame travel with satisfaction, noting whether it burned evenly. A misfiring bomb was unacceptable. Precision extended to all aspects of his work. As he aged, Jhin's body reminded him of time's passage. His once youthful hands developed calluses and scars. His joints sometimes ached after hours of holding his cane in the same position. He adjusted his training accordingly, adding stretching and breathing exercises to maintain flexibility. He began to rely more on misdirection and less on sheer physical prowess. He recruited no apprentices, for he trusted no one with his methods. If he needed assistance, he used unwitting accomplices. A merchant asked to deliver a package. A child paid to hang lanterns in specific places. They never knew they were part of a performance. He found that layering ignorance into his art added a new dimension. The innocence of those he manipulated contrasted with the guilt of those he killed. Contrast, he knew, was essential. He often visited places of learning under assumed identities. At an academy in Wele, he attended lectures on philosophy given by a scholar who believed beauty could only exist in the absence of harm. Jhin asked the scholar, "Can a storm be beautiful?" The scholar answered, "Yes, from a distance." Jhin then asked, "If you are in the storm and it destroys your home, does its beauty vanish?" The scholar hesitated. Students murmured. Jhin smiled and left. At a scientific exhibition in Piltover, he watched a demonstration of sound waves projected through water. The patterns formed mesmerized him. He imagined using similar waves to manipulate petals mid-air. He purchased the apparatus and spent nights adjusting it, aiming for a future performance where sound alone arranged elements. He sought to challenge himself constantly. Stagnation was death for an artist. Not all of his killings were grand. Sometimes he acted on impulse. Once, while traveling through a mountain pass, he encountered 4 bandits preparing to ambush a merchant caravan. He could have ignored them. They were not part of a commission. Instead, he decided to intervene. He positioned himself on a cliff overlooking the narrow path. He waited until the bandits stepped out, weapons drawn, voices raised. He fired 4 shots in quick succession, each bullet finding its mark. The bandits fell, their blood staining the snow. The merchants looked around wildly, saw no one, and hurried on, whispering prayers of thanks to unseen spirits. Jhin wrote on the cliff face with his glove finger, "Good deeds can be art." He left before anyone came. Acts like these were rare, but reminded him that he was not bound by others' plans. His art could be spontaneous. The interplay between his work and Ionian politics intensified during the aftermath of the Navori conflict. Jhin realized that every death he caused could be interpreted as support for one faction or another. He exploited this ambiguity. When he killed a radical militant who had burned down villages, the moderates praised him. When he killed a complacent noble who ignored his people's suffering, the radicals cheered. He aimed to erode the boundaries between factions, forcing them to confront their own contradictions. He sent letters to newspapers written under pseudonyms, praising and condemning himself in equal measure. He fed rumors that he was a spirit of vengeance, then fed counter-rumors that he was a foreign agent. The more confused people became, the more they talked about him. Discussion itself became part of his composition. He was not just a man with a gun. He was an idea that spread like smoke. His musings on his own psyche sometimes led him down corridors of thought as twisty as the catacombs he hid in. He wondered whether he loved or hated his audience. Did he derive pleasure from their terror because he wished to punish them for ignoring him as a child? Or did he see them as collaborators, necessary for the completion of his art? He oscillated between contempt and gratitude. He wrote, "Without an audience, a performance is rehearsal." He also wrote, "Audiences are unreliable. They interpret instead of see." He acknowledged that once he released a performance into the world, he lost control of its interpretation. This loss both infuriated and liberated him. He could never entirely predict how his work would be perceived. Unpredictability added spice. In his later years, he began to think about legacy, not just the memory of his killings, but the techniques he pioneered. He considered writing a manual for future artists an absurd thought, given he never trusted anyone, but he toyed with the idea. He drafted titles like "On the Intersection of Violence and Aesthetics and the Fourfold Path to Mastery." He outlined chapters, choosing a stage, selecting a palette, orchestrating reaction, preserving anonymity. Each time he wrote, he tore up the pages. Sharing his methods felt like diminishing his uniqueness. He decided instead to hide clues in his performances, puzzles that a successor might decode if one ever arose. The thought of someone else continuing his work both comforted and disturbed him. He did not wish to be forgotten, but he also could not bear the idea of being surpassed. Once, a spirit approached him. It happened in a forest at dusk when he was retrieving a lotus bomb he had hidden and decided not to use. The air thickened, and a translucent figure stepped out from a tree. It was an ancient entity, its form shifting between male and female, animal and plant. It regarded him with eyes that reflected starlight. In his mind, he heard, "Why do you shape endings?" He answered aloud, "To create beauty." The spirit replied, "Beauty exists without you." He considered this. He argued, "But does it resonate as strongly without the contrast I provide?" The spirit did not answer. Instead, it reached out and touched his mask with a tendril of mist. For a moment, he saw himself not as an artist, but as a ripple in a vast ocean of lives. Then the spirit was gone. He stood there, heart pounding, mask cold where the mist had touched. He returned to his camp and added a note to his journal. "Even spirits critique art." He laughed softly. The world contained more judges than he had imagined. At times, he found himself haunting places he had performed, as if seeking echoes of his own actions. He visited the valley where he had arranged the family around a table. The house had been rebuilt. The courtyard now had flowers. He stood in the shadows and listened to the new family laugh over dinner. They had no idea what had occurred where they sat. He wondered if the land remembered. Did stone and soil hold the impressions of sorrow and fear? He walked through the garden where he had shot the final target amidst lotus bombs. The trees had grown. Children now played under their shade. He observed them and felt a fleeting pang. Time erases, but art leaves traces. He noticed a faint scorch mark on a stone wall, the only remaining evidence. He touched it with gloved fingers and felt satisfaction. His signature persisted even after petals had rotted. The most elaborate performance he considered but never executed involved 4 high towers in a city built on cliffs. He planned to synchronize a series of shots and explosions so that each tower would collapse in a way that formed the outline of a lotus when viewed from the sea. He spent months studying architecture, consulting with masons under false pretenses. He made scale models and tested them, adjusting the positions of supports and charges. He wrote music to accompany the collapses, imagining how the sound would echo off the cliffs. He trained his body to move along ropes and scaffolding in preparation for planting charges at great heights. In the end, he chose not to execute the piece. The risk of unintended casualties beyond his chosen 4 was too high. The potential for uncontrolled chaos violated his principles. Nevertheless, he kept the plans and the music. He sometimes hummed the tune to himself when he needed inspiration. He also explored mediums beyond physical violence. Inspired by Zornite technology and Piltoverian engineering, he once created a device that projected shadows onto walls. He used it to tell a story in silhouettes. The piece was performed in an abandoned temple where he knew pilgrims would gather the next morning. He arranged 4 panels and placed lit lanterns behind them. When the sun set, the device projected images on the temple's interior walls. First a flower blooming, then a sword being drawn, then a bird in flight, and finally a mask being put on. There were no bodies. The performance was silent except for the rustle of paper and the crackle of wicks. He watched from the rafters as villagers entered and gasped at the moving shadows. Some wept, moved by the beauty. Others whispered in fear, recognizing the symbolism. Jhin considered this an experiment in non-lethal art. He concluded that while it stirred emotions, it lacked the visceral impact he craved. He folded up the device and donated it anonymously to an orphanage. Perhaps children would use it to tell stories. He smiled at the thought. His relationship with his gun deepened over time. He polished it after every performance, mindful of each scratch and dent. He adjusted the tension of the trigger, ensuring it required the perfect amount of pressure. He replaced springs and oiled joints. He carved small designs into the wooden stock, adding to its beauty. He spoke to it occasionally, a habit he developed out of both intimacy and pragmatism. "We are partners," he would whisper, "our fates intertwined." He taught himself to sleep with it within reach. He practiced disassembling and reassembling it blindfolded, using only touch. When he considered using Hextech enhancements, he tested prototypes and rejected them. They made the gun hum with energy, disrupting its pristine sound. He was a traditionalist in this one area. The gun's 4 barrels represented not just function, but philosophy. He could not compromise that. On one journey, he sailed with a merchant vessel across a calm sea. The ocean's vastness reminded him of the stage he had considered on Mount Targon. He leaned against the railing, Cain resting beside him, and watched as the moon cast silver paths across the waves. The sailors sang shanties to keep time as they raised and lowered sails. He listened, absorbing the rhythm, the rise and fall of voices. He hummed along quietly. He thought about performing at sea. Could he arrange bodies on a deck in a way that would remain intact as the ship rolled? He concluded that water would ruin his composition. Still, the idea of a performance with the ocean as the only audience appealed to him. He wrote a stanza about it, 4 stars reflected on water's ink-black page, a silent audience to an unseen play. He tucked the stanza into his journal, perhaps to use one day. At another time, he disguised himself as a healer traveling with a caravan to the Shuriman border. He wanted to observe the desert and its endless dunes. The heat was oppressive, the sky merciless. He marveled at how the landscape could swallow footsteps and erase any trace of passage. The desert reminded him of the role of time in erasing the evidence of his art. He saw ruins emerging from the sand like bones. He listened to tales of ascended beings and ancient cities buried beneath dunes. He considered staging a performance there, perhaps involving shadows cast by obelisks at sunset. But the lack of vegetation and the unpredictability of sandstorms deterred him. He wrote a poem about absence instead. Sometimes a poem sufficed when a performance would not. Not every idea needed to manifest in death. His contemplation of Freljord was different. He imagined blood on snow, the stark contrast of red on white. He pictured 4 standing stones with bodies arranged between them. He considered the sound of gunfire muffled by snowfall, the absence of echo. He knew little of the Freljord's culture aside from songs of war and valor. He read about their shamans and their respect for omens. He briefly entertained traveling there, but the cold did not appeal to him. Cold numbed senses, and he liked his senses sharp. Still, he wrote a melody inspired by the idea, a slow, haunting tune with long pauses. He never used it. He often thought of his mask as his true face. Without it, he felt exposed. He only removed it when absolutely alone. Even then, he avoided mirrors. He did not want to see the face that had once been invisible. He wanted to see the mask reflected back. He cleaned it meticulously, using cloths of the finest silk. He repaired chips and cracks with gold lacquer, turning imperfections into embellishments. He considered how the mask influenced his breathing and his speech. It forced him to enunciate, to project his voice. It muffled certain tones, lending his words an ethereal quality. He discovered that people listened more intently to someone whose face they could not read. The unknown demanded attention. He used this to his advantage, letting pauses hang longer, letting his silence speak as loudly as his words. He sometimes wondered if the mask influenced his thoughts, if wearing it for so long fused it to his mind. He concluded that it did. He could no longer imagine living without it. When he planned his own potential finale, he considered 4 locations: the stage where he had first learned the art of theatre, the field where he had first killed an animal, the monastery where he had learned discipline, and the festival where he had been captured. He imagined placing a part of himself in each: a piece of his mask, a petal from a lotus, a bullet, a verse. He pictured audiences stumbling upon these objects and piecing together the narrative. He imagined them realizing that he had orchestrated his own end with the same care he had orchestrated theirs. He imagined their reactions: tears, curses, perhaps even applause. He wrote 4 versions of this finale, each with different sequences. He could not decide which he liked best. For now he kept them in a compartment inside his cane, folded neatly. The act of planning comforted him. It meant that his story would conclude on his terms, not someone else's. In quieter years, between commissions, he took to teaching himself new crafts. He tried pottery, finding satisfaction in the way clay yielded to his hands. He admired the way a pot's shape could influence how it held and poured liquid. He imagined crafting vessels that broke beautifully when exploded. He learned basic carpentry, making small boxes with hidden hinges. He appreciated the patience it required. He told himself that diversifying his skills would keep his mind sharp. In reality, these activities filled the spaces between performances. He could not be killing constantly. Art required rest. When he could not create death, he created containers for it. He stored bombs in his boxes, poems in his pots. He labeled each in his mind, though he never wrote the labels down. If he ever felt loneliness, he crushed it beneath purpose. He knew that companionship demanded vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened his control. He sometimes imagined conversations with someone who understood him completely. He imagined explaining his process and having it appreciated. He imagined someone who could discuss rhythms and lighting without flinching at blood. No such person existed in his world. The closest he came was when he stood across from Shen or Zed or Irelia, each of them artists in their own right. He sensed in them a dedication to craft that mirrored his own. He respected that even as he sought to kill them. Respect, he realized, could coexist with enmity. It could even enhance the thrill. Knowing his adversaries were worthy made the dance more exciting. As he writes in his internal treatise, "My art is not about death. Death is inevitable. My art is about attention. In a world where millions perish unnoticed, I insist that some deaths be seen, be contemplated, be remembered." He knows others will argue that there are kinder ways to draw attention. He dismisses them. Kindness is quiet. It soothes, then fades. Violence carves itself into memory. He leaves scars, physical and mental, because scars are stories etched into flesh. He understands that for some, his work is unforgivable. He accepts that. He does not seek forgiveness. He seeks reaction. He admits that he is addicted to it. "I have felt applause," he writes, "and I can no longer live without it." Applause in his world is a gasp, a scream, a stunned silence. Those are his ovations. Even as he contemplates such weighty matters, he retains a childlike curiosity about new materials and techniques. During a visit to a festival in which artists displayed paper kites of fantastic shapes, he marveled at their engineering. He bought 4 kites and flew them alone in a meadow, laughing as they dipped and danced in the wind. He studied the frames and knots, understanding how tension allowed them to catch air. He imagined attaching small charges to kites and using wind to deliver explosions silently. He sketched designs for bombs shaped like birds that could glide into a performance silently, then detonate in showers of petals. The idea delighted him. He built prototypes and tested them over a lake, watching as they skimmed across water before bursting. He tucked this concept away for future use. Years after his release, he heard a rumor that someone else had been committing killings similar to his style. At first, he dismissed it as a fabrication, a copycat seeking attention. Then he saw the scene, a corpse arranged at the foot of a statue, 4 candles burning around it. The composition was crude. The alignment was off. The candles were of different heights. It offended him. He tracked the rumor to a young man seeking notoriety. he found the man bragging in a tavern. Jhin sat beside him, unmasked but disguised, and listened. When the man claimed to be the golden demon, Jhin laughed quietly. The man puffed up, insulted. Jhin offered to toast his success. The man drank. Moments later, he gasped and clutched his throat as the poison took effect. Jhin stood and placed a lotus on the table. "There is only one virtuoso," he whispered before leaving. He had no intention of sharing the stage. At one point, he orchestrated a performance to coincide with a celestial event. A rare comet was predicted to streak across the sky on the longest night of the year. Ionians prepared festivals and ceremonies to honor it. Jhin planned to kill 4 astronomers who had predicted the comet's path. He timed the shots so that each body would fall just as the comet became visible. He positioned himself on a cliff overlooking the observatory. He waited, listening to the astronomers argue about lenses and calculations. When the comet appeared, a streak of silver against velvet, he fired. Each shot punctuated a gasp. Each body slumped as the comet burned overhead. The juxtaposition of cosmic beauty and intimate horror pleased him immensely. He wrote a stanza. "As heaven writes light across dark, I write dark across light." He considered having it carved into stone, but decided letting the event live in rumor was better. The unknown would embellish it. He occasionally visited libraries to read plays and histories, often disguised. In a coastal city, he read a play about a sculptor who fell in love with his own statue. The sculptor could not see anyone else's beauty after perfecting his own creation. Jhin felt kinship. He too loved his work to the exclusion of others. He thought about what it meant to be so absorbed in creation that relationships became irrelevant. He wondered if that was tragic or enviable. He concluded that it was both. Tragic for those who expected him to behave like a human. Enviable for those who understood the joy of losing oneself in art. He returned the play and thanked the librarian who had no idea she had assisted the golden demon. During a particularly introspective period, he camped by a waterfall and tried to meditate. The constant roar made it difficult to focus on his inner monologue. He instead focused on the patterns of water, how droplets clung together, then separated, how mist formed at the base. He imagined gunpowder as water, each grain adhering until an explosion forced them apart. He picked up pebbles and arranged them on a flat rock, moving them until the composition satisfied him. He realized that even without death, he could not stop arranging. His mind sought order. He spent hours creating patterns with pebbles and leaves, only to destroy them with a sweep of his hand. The act of destruction gave him a small thrill. He wondered if he could ever create something and let it remain intact. He doubted it. He carried with him tokens from his past. A fragment of the rope used to bind him at Jhin Pass, a petal from the first lotus bomb he crafted, a small piece of silk from the costume of the troup's lead actor. He kept these in a compartment in his cane. Sometimes he took them out and arranged them in a line, remembering their origins. He did not feel sentimentality exactly. He felt continuity. His life, though chaotic, followed a pattern. Each token represented a turn in his story. They anchored him, reminding him that he was not a spirit, but a man who had moved through places and left marks. They also reminded him that he owed no one his loyalty. His past companions were gone, his mentors dead, his rivals aged. He remained singular. As he moved toward the present day, Jhin noticed the world shifting more rapidly than ever. Hextech airships crossed skies, carrying goods and people faster than any horse or ship. Banners bearing symbols of newly formed alliances fluttered over cities. People communicated using devices that transmitted voices over distance. Jhin adapted. He learned to account for these variables. He targeted an official traveling by airship, shooting him through a glass window from a mountain ledge. He infiltrated a company that manufactured communication devices, planting bombs in 4 towers that carried signals. He hesitated to use the devices himself. He preferred the quiet exchange of letters and the tangible feel of paper. He acknowledged, however, that technology expanded his potential audience. News of his killings reached across continents in days instead of weeks. His fame grew accordingly. He relished it. A final scene worth mentioning involved his brief meeting with a young musician who would one day compose ballads about him. The musician, unaware of his identity, played a haunting melody on a lute in a tavern. Jhin, drawn by the music, listened from a shadowed corner. The melody moved him, stirring emotions he rarely acknowledged. After the performance, he approached the musician and commended his skill. The musician thanked him, eyes shining with gratitude. Jhin asked, "Do you play for applause or for the music itself?" The young man answered, "For both. Without an audience, the music feels incomplete." Jhin nodded, understanding. He left without killing him. Years later, the musician wrote a song about a masked killer who sought beauty in death. The song was banned in some provinces and celebrated in others. Jhin heard it once, hummed along and smiled. Art begets art. The tapestry of his life is woven with threads of music, death, philosophy, and travel. It is impossible to separate them. He is at once a murderer and a connoisseur, a student of human nature and its manipulator. He moves through Runeterra like a brush across canvas, leaving strokes of red and white, smoke and silence. He does not expect to be understood, only to be experienced. Those who have crossed his path carry the weight of that experience like an invisible tattoo. Stories about him will continue to evolve, growing in scope and distortion. The truth matters less than the reaction. In the end, Kadar Jhin remains what he always sought to be, not a man, not a myth, but a performance that never truly ends. And thus his story continues, a song that refuses to fade into memory.